There is an iron gate on First Avenue in Manhattan that has been standing for nearly 3 centuries. Behind it rises a 25-story tower of glass and concrete, its windows lit at all hours, overlooking the black water of the East River. To the north and south, the city rushes past in its usual indifference. But here, in the Kips Bay neighborhood, something older and heavier seems to press against the modern facade. The ground remembers. This is Bellevue. The name alone carries weight in New York. It has meant different things to different generations. A hospital, an asylum, a last resort, a warning. Parents whispered it, poets wrote it down. For nearly 300 years, the city has sent here the people it had run out of answers for. The destitute, the feverish, the lost, the mad, and the dying. And somehow, against epidemic, disaster, neglect, and the sheer crushing weight of human suffering, Bellevue never closed its doors. What follows is not a story of scandal or glory. It is something quieter and more unsettling than either. It is the story of a city growing faster than its conscience could keep pace with, and the single institution left to absorb the consequences. Cholera wards packed beyond capacity. A psychiatric pavilion that gave the whole hospital its darkest reputation. Doctors performing procedures no one had ever attempted, on patients who had no other options. America's oldest public hospital did not survive because it was the best. It survived because, for the people who needed it most, it was the only place that would not turn them away. Chapter 1. A Place for the Discarded. To understand what Bellevue was, you first have to understand what a hospital meant in the 18th century. It was not what we picture today. There were no antiseptics, no trained nursing staff, no understanding of how disease actually spread. There was no germ theory, no sterile instruments, no meaningful distinction between a physician's intuition and outright guesswork. A hospital in 1736 was not a place you went to get better. It was a place you went when there was nowhere left to go, and, more often than not, it was a place you went to live your last days. That is the institution Bellevue began as. In the spring of 1736, the city of New York completed a 2-story brick building on the city commons, the open ground that is now City Hall Park. It was called an almshouse, and it held 6 beds. Its purpose was not medicine. Its purpose was containment. The people sent there were the city's poor, its vagrants, its orphans, its elderly with no families to care for them, its sick with no money to pay a doctor. Colonial New York had no interest in curing these people. It had an interest in keeping them out of sight. The city these people lived in was, by modern standards, extraordinarily hostile to human health. Lower Manhattan in the mid-1700s was a place of open sewers running alongside unpaved streets, drinking water drawn from wells contaminated by the same ground that absorbed the city's waste, and housing so densely packed that disease moved through neighborhoods like fire through dry grass. The wealthy lived uptown or retreated to the countryside when the summer heat made the lower city unbearable. The poor had no such option. They stayed and they suffered. The medical understanding of the era did nothing to help them. The dominant theory of disease at the time was miasma theory, the belief that illness was caused by bad air, by the poisonous vapors rising from rotting organic matter, from standing water, from the general filth of urban life. There was a grain of truth buried inside this idea. Disease did cluster around filthy, overcrowded places, but the conclusion doctors drew was almost entirely wrong. The treatment, therefore, was also wrong. Patients were moved to higher ground, given purges and bleedings to rid the body of corrupted humors, and ventilated with fresh air that did little against the bacteria and viruses actually killing them. The almshouse operated under these assumptions. For decades, Bellevue remained this, a holding facility for human misery, underfunded and overwhelmed, staffed by people with limited training, operating on theories that were fundamentally mistaken. Then, in the 1790s, the city's indifference was shattered by something it could not ignore. Yellow fever came to New York in waves during the decade, and it did not discriminate, though it killed the poor in far greater numbers than the rich who could afford to flee. The epidemic of 1795 was among the worst. Between 3,000 and 3,500 New Yorkers died. The city's most severe cases were sent to Bellevue, which was by then operating out of a facility near the East River, where patients could at least benefit from the open air off the water. Into this chaos stepped a young doctor named Alexander Anderson. He was 20 years old. He had almost no experience. He had, by the standards of his era, almost no tools, and he worked through the epidemic anyway, treating the worst cases the city could produce, watching the limits of his own medical knowledge play out in the beds around him. Dr. Anderson would go on to become better known as an illustrator than as a physician. He eventually abandoned medicine for engraving and became one of early America's most celebrated artists. But his weeks at Bellevue during the yellow fever crisis represent something important: the beginning of a pattern. When the city broke down, Bellevue bore the consequences, and the people who worked there did what they could with what they had. In 1798, the city purchased Bellevue Farm, a property along the East River several miles north of the settled city, which had already been used informally to quarantine the sick. The hospital would be formally named Bellevue Hospital in 1824. By then, New York was changing at a speed that no one had anticipated, and no institution was prepared for. The city's population was beginning the explosive growth that would define the entire 19th century. Immigrants were arriving in numbers that strained every public system the city possessed, and Bellevue, underfunded and understaffed, was about to be asked to carry a weight that should have broken it. It didn't break, but what came next would test it in ways its founders could never have imagined. Chapter 2: Scalpels and Students. In 1787, something changed at Bellevue, quietly, without fanfare, but with consequences that would ripple forward for generations. Columbia University's College of Physicians and Surgeons began assigning faculty and medical students to the hospital. It was not a grand partnership. There were no formal agreements, no purpose-built facilities, no ceremony to mark the occasion. Medical students simply began appearing at the bedsides of the poor and the dying, notebooks in hand, watching and learning from the only patients who couldn't refuse them. The wealthy sick were treated at home by private physicians in the privacy of their own bedrooms. The patients at Bellevue had no such privilege. Their suffering became curriculum. It was a morally uncomfortable arrangement, and it remained so for a long time. But it was also the first indication that Bellevue might become something more than a warehouse for human misery. If medicine was going to advance, it needed bodies to learn from, and Bellevue had bodies. The problem in the early decades of American medical education was that it needed more of them than it could legally obtain. Dissection of cadavers was the only way to truly understand anatomy, and anatomy was the foundation of surgery. But in the early 19th century, the act of dissecting was widely considered a desecration, morally offensive to a society with deep religious convictions about the sanctity of the dead. Medical schools were legally permitted almost no cadavers. The result was an open secret: body snatching. It was illegal, it was widespread, and everyone involved understood exactly what was happening. New York University arrived at Bellevue in 1819, bringing with it a second stream of medical faculty and students, and a second set of competing ambitions. The presence of two major academic institutions pushing against each other had the effect of gradually raising standards, not out of altruism, but out of rivalry. Medicine at Bellevue began, slowly and unevenly, to become more rigorous. The Bone Bill of 1854 was a turning point. Formally called the Act to Promote Medical Science and Protect Burial Grounds, it legalized the use of unclaimed bodies, those of people who died in almshouses, prisons, and public hospitals without family to claim them, for anatomical study. The grim irony wrote itself. The same people Bellevue had always served in life were now, in death, becoming the material through which American medicine educated itself. The body snatchers mostly went away. The cadavers kept coming. In 1849, a surgical amphitheater opened at Bellevue, a room designed specifically so that operations could be observed by students arranged in tiered seating around the surgeon. Medicine was becoming a public, teachable science. Procedures that had previously been performed in private, guarded as proprietary knowledge by individual physicians, were now being demonstrated, analyzed, and debated. The amphitheater represented a philosophical shift as much as an architectural one, the acknowledgement that medicine advanced through shared knowledge, not jealously guarded secrets. Then came 1861. The The Bellevue Hospital Medical College, the first medical college in New York with a direct connection to a functioning hospital, opened its doors. Within 24 hours, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter, and the United States lurched toward the war that would transform everything. Bellevue's students and faculty went to the front in large numbers. Dozens of interns left to serve the Union cause. The hospital issued certificates of completion to students who interrupted their studies for military service. A quiet acknowledgement that the war itself was a form of medical education more intense than anything a classroom could provide. Those who joined the Confederacy reportedly received no such recognition from the college. What the war produced in medical terms was a generation of physicians who had seen more trauma in a few years than most doctors witnessed in a lifetime. Dr. Titus Cone was 25 years old when he wrote home from Bellevue in 1862, describing himself as having sole management of his wards unless he called in a visiting physician for the most extreme cases. 400 patients from campaigns in Virginia and along the James River filled the beds around him. He called Bellevue, without irony, the ideal place for learning medicine. After Gettysburg, 613 soldiers arrived at Bellevue for treatment. 613 men, in a matter of days, flooding into a hospital that was already operating beyond its intended capacity. And then there was Dr. Charles Leal, a recent Bellevue graduate, 23 years old, stationed near Washington in the spring of 1865. On the evening of April 14th, he was in the audience at Ford's Theater when a shot was fired from the presidential box. He was the first physician to reach Abraham Lincoln. He credited his training at Bellevue, specifically under Dr. Frank Hamilton, with giving him whatever tools he had to work with in those desperate minutes. They were not enough to save the president, but they were more than most young doctors of that era would have possessed. The Civil War did not make Bellevue a great institution, but it proved something that would define the hospital for the next century and a half. That when the scale of human suffering exceeded what medicine could handle, Bellevue was where that gap became most visible, and where the people trying to close it did their most consequential work. The war also made painfully clear how much medicine still did not know. Infection killed more men than combat. Treatments that doctors administered with confidence did nothing, or made things worse. The foundations of modern medicine had not yet been laid. That reckoning was coming, and Bellevue would be at the center of it. Chapter 3: When the City Bled. Between 1800 and 1900, the population of what would become New York City grew from roughly 60,000 people to nearly 3.5 million, a 30-fold expansion in a single century, the product of wave after wave of immigration and industrialization that remade the geography and the character of the entire region in one century. The infrastructure of the city did not grow with it. The New York that immigrants arrived in during the middle decades of the 19th century was a city of extraordinary and terrible density. The tenements of the Lower East Side packed entire families, sometimes multiple families, into single rooms with no ventilation, no running water, and no separation from the waste that accumulated in the streets and courtyards below. A family might share a building with 100 other people and have access to a single outdoor privy. Drinking water came from wells that sat within feet of the same contaminated ground. Children played in streets where animals lived and died. The air in summer was heavy with the smell of rot. For a believer in miasma theory, this environment was a medical catastrophe waiting to happen. And they were right about that, even if wrong about why. For the people actually living there, it was simply home. They had no alternative. When cholera arrived in New York in 1832, the city was not prepared. It could not have been. Cholera, caused by a waterborne bacterium that would not be identified for another half-century, moved through contaminated water supplies with a speed and lethality that overwhelmed every response the city attempted. The poor, crowded into the most unsanitary conditions, died in the greatest numbers. The wealthy left the city when they could. Those who couldn't leave, the workers, the immigrants, the destitute, stayed and faced the epidemic with whatever they had. Bellevue received the worst cases. Its wards filled beyond capacity. Doctors administered treatments that ranged from useless to actively harmful, purges, bleedings, opiates, all delivered with the sincere confidence of men who believed they understood what they were fighting. They did not. Cholera returned in 1849, reportedly killing more than 5,000 New Yorkers in a single summer, according to contemporary accounts. The pattern repeated itself with grim fidelity. The poor died in disproportionate numbers, the hospital filled, the doctors did what they could within the limits of what medicine knew, and the limits were severe. It was not only cholera. Yellow fever returned periodically through the mid-century. Typhus moved through the immigrant ships arriving from Europe, so commonly associated with the crossings that it was sometimes called ship fever, and spread from the docks into the tenements. Smallpox flared with regularity. Each outbreak sent another wave of the city's most desperate to Bellevue's doors, and each time, the hospital received them into wards that were never designed for the volume they held. Through all of it, miasma theory held its grip on medical practice. Even as evidence accumulated that disease followed contaminated water rather than bad air, the old framework died slowly. Bellevue's physicians were not uniquely resistant to new ideas. They reflected the mainstream of their profession, which moved cautiously, conservatively, and often decades behind the evidence. Germ theory began making serious inroads in American medicine only after the Civil War, and even then it faced fierce resistance from doctors who had built entire careers on the old model. The patients in Bellevue's wards bore the cost of that institutional inertia. By the turn of the 20th century, the city's tuberculosis crisis had become impossible to ignore. Consumption, as it was commonly known, had been killing New Yorkers for generations, moving silently through the tenements, the factories, the crowded transit lines of an industrializing city. In 1903, Bellevue established its chest service specifically to address the epidemic. It was one of the first dedicated tuberculosis units at any public hospital in the country, an acknowledgement, finally, that the scale of the disease required a systematic institutional response rather than case-by-case management. The chest service represented something new in Bellevue's history, not merely reacting to catastrophe, but building a structure designed to outlast it. That capacity for adaptation would be tested almost immediately. In the autumn of 1918, influenza arrived, the Spanish flu, so-called not because it originated in Spain, but because Spain, neutral in the First World War, had a free press that reported on it openly, was unlike anything the modern world had seen. It killed with extraordinary speed, and it killed the young and healthy in numbers that defied every assumption doctors held about how disease worked. In New York City, thousands died within weeks. Bellevue's wards filled with patients whose lungs were failing faster than any treatment could address. Staff fell ill alongside the people they were trying to help. Nurses who had come in for a morning shift were themselves patients by evening. The hospital operated in a state of controlled emergency that lasted for months. Its resources stretched to a point that should have caused it to break. But it didn't break. This is the paradox that sits at the center of Bellevue's entire history, and it is worth holding for a moment. The hospital was, repeatedly and undeniably, a place where the limits of medicine were most painfully visible. Patients arrived and died from diseases that were not yet understood, treated with methods that were not yet adequate, in a facility that was never sufficiently funded or staffed for the volume it received. And yet it was the only institution those patients could turn to, and it never turned them away. There is a different word for an institution that receives catastrophe after catastrophe, that operates perpetually beyond its capacity, that keeps its doors open through epidemics and floods and decades of political neglect. That word is not failure, that word is endurance. Chapter 4. Pavilion for the Insane. In 1879, Bellevue opened a dedicated pavilion for the insane. By the standards of its era, this was considered a progressive act. The prevailing practice in American cities had been to house the mentally ill alongside criminals, the destitute, and the physically sick, all collapsed together in the same wards, the same cells, the same institutional indifference. A separate facility, designed specifically for psychiatric patients, represented at least an acknowledgement that mental illness was a medical condition rather than simply a behavioral problem to be contained. Reformers celebrated it. The press noted it approvingly. What it looked like in practice was something more complicated. The psychiatric understanding of the 1870s had almost nothing in common with what we would recognize today. Mental illness was understood, in varying combinations depending on the physician and the patient, as a moral failing, a hereditary defect, a consequence of intemperate living, or evidence of a fundamentally disordered character. The treatments available reflected these assumptions. Patients were restrained when they were disruptive. They were isolated when they were distressing to others. Cold water therapies, the application of water at extreme temperatures to shock the nervous system into compliance, were considered legitimate medical interventions. The goal of psychiatric care in this period was rarely recovery in any meaningful sense. It was management. It was the removal of troubling people from public view and their placement somewhere the public did not have to think about them. Bellevue's Pavilion fit within this system. It was a way station. Patients were assessed there before being transferred to longer-term institutions on Blackwell's Island or elsewhere in the city's network of asylums. The stays were often brief, the assessments were often cursory, and the population that moved through the ward was like Bellevue's, general population, drawn overwhelmingly from the city's poorest and most vulnerable. Immigrants who couldn't communicate in English and were assessed as confused or irrational, workers whose poverty had collapsed into crisis, people whose behavior frightened their neighbors, and who had no family with the resources to manage them privately. It was this ward, more than any other part of the hospital, that gave Bellevue its lasting reputation in the popular imagination. To be sent to Bellevue became, in New York vernacular, a shorthand for psychiatric institutionalization, a phrase that carried with it all the fear, stigma, and helplessness that the word asylum had always implied. Parents used it as a warning. Neighbors used it as a threat. The name of the hospital attached itself to a specific cultural terror, the terror of losing one's mind and having the city decide what to do with you. Mark Harris, writing in New York Magazine decades later, called Bellevue the Chelsea Hotel of the Mad, a phrase that captured something real about the institution's strange cultural gravity, the way it attracted and absorbed extreme human experience while the rest of the city looked away. Within that gravity, however, something genuinely significant was happening. David Wexler arrived at Bellevue in 1932 and would remain there until 1967, serving for much of that time as chief psychologist. Working directly with the patients moving through the psychiatric wards, Wexler became dissatisfied with the dominant intelligence testing tools of his era, particularly the Stanford-Binet scale, which he found poorly suited to the adult patients he was actually trying to understand. Out of that dissatisfaction, he developed what would become the Wexler Adult Intelligence Scale, known as the WAIS, and later the Wexler Intelligence Scale for Children, the WISC. These tests, developed inside a public psychiatric ward, applied first to the patients of a safety net hospital, became among the most widely used intelligence assessment tools in the world. By the 1960s, the WAIS had surpassed the Stanford-Binet in popularity among American clinicians, as the 1960 revision of the Stanford-Binet had been widely regarded as less carefully developed than its predecessors. The science of understanding the human mind was, in part, built inside Bellevue's psychiatric wards. The cultural figures who passed through those wards tell their own kind of story. Allen Ginsberg, the poet who would become one of the defining voices of the Beat generation, was allegedly a patient at Bellevue in the late 1940s. Reportedly, after a series of legal difficulties, led a judge to offer him the choice between prison and psychiatric evaluation. What he took from those months, he never fully specified. But 8 years later, in 1955, he named Bellevue explicitly in his poem, Howl, placing it among the institutions that had consumed the best minds of his generation, a symbol of what the post-war American system did to those who didn't fit within it. Norman Mailer was brought to Bellevue in 1960 after stabbing his wife at a party. He was processed through the same psychiatric evaluation system as everyone else, the same intake procedures, the same institutional indifference to celebrity. Bellevue had always received the famous and the anonymous with equal bureaucratic efficiency. Mark David Chapman experienced this same leveling when he shuttled between Bellevue and Rikers Island after shooting John Lennon outside the Dakota Building in December of 1980. Whatever a person had done, whatever they were known for, the ward received them the same way it had always received everyone, as a problem requiring assessment and disposition. In 1998, the old psychiatric building, the physical structure that had housed all of this history, was converted into a men's homeless shelter. The city had concluded that whatever other use the building might serve, it would continue to house the people society didn't know what else to do with. The continuity was so complete, it almost seemed intentional. The Pavilion for the Insane gave Bellevue its darkest name, but what that name really reflects, what it has always reflected, is not something particular to one hospital on First Avenue. It reflects what America has consistently done with the people whose suffering is inconvenient, built a place to put them, called it care, and looked away. Chapter 5, Where American Medicine Was Invented. There is another story inside Bellevue's history, one that sits in uncomfortable tension with everything that came before it. Alongside the overcrowded wards, the inadequate treatments, the epidemics that overwhelmed every response the hospital could mount, yet something else was happening inside these same buildings. Procedures were being attempted for the first time in human history. Institutions were being created that would define how medicine organized itself for generations. People were doing work inside a chronically underfunded public hospital that would eventually shape the experience of patients in every corner of the developed world. The history of American medicine, told honestly, runs directly through Bellevue, and that history begins earlier than most people assume. In 1799, Bellevue opened the first dedicated maternity ward in the United States. Women giving birth in early American cities did so at home if they were fortunate, attended by midwives or family members with almost no access to trained medical assistants. Those who had no home, no family, no resources, the immigrant women, the destitute, the abandoned, had nowhere to turn. Bellevue gave them somewhere. It was not a comfortable place, and the mortality rates of the era reflected the limits of obstetric knowledge, but it existed when nothing else did. In 1808, a surgeon at Bellevue performed the world's first successful ligation of the femoral artery to treat an aneurysm. The procedure, tying off a major blood vessel in the leg to prevent a potentially fatal rupture, had never been successfully completed before. It was the kind of innovation that only happens at a place where surgeons are regularly confronted with conditions they have no established protocol for, where the sheer volume and variety of patients forces medicine to improvise and document and try again. That same spirit produced in 1869 one of Bellevue's most practically consequential contributions to public health, the civilian ambulance service. Dr. Edward Dalton had served as a regimental surgeon during the Civil War and had worked with the United States Ambulance Corps, the military system developed to retrieve the wounded from battlefields before they died of neglect. He returned from the war with a straightforward conviction. The same principles should apply to civilians in a city. When someone collapsed in the street, when a worker was injured in a factory, when anyone anywhere in New York needed emergency medical attention, there should be a trained physician and a vehicle capable of reaching them. What made Dalton's system remarkable was its infrastructure. Rather than building something entirely new, he connected the ambulance service to the police telegraph lines already running throughout the city. A call for help could be dispatched to the nearest station, and a doctor, accompanied by a driver and equipped with medical supplies, could be moving toward the scene within minutes. It should be noted that Bellevue's was not the first civilian ambulance service in the United States. Commercial Hospital in Cincinnati had established years earlier, in 1865. But Bellevue's system, with its telegraph dispatch infrastructure and its physician-accompanied response model, became the template that spread. The basic logic of emergency medical dispatch that Dalton designed on police telegraph lines is the ancestor of every emergency response system operating today. The innovations kept coming, across decades, with a consistency that demands attention. 1873. The nation's first nursing school, grounded in Florence Nightingale's principles, opened at Bellevue, establishing the idea that nursing was a trained profession, requiring systematic education rather than an informal extension of domestic caregiving. 1874. The nation's first children's clinic, acknowledging that pediatric medicine was a distinct field requiring its own approach. 1876. The nation's first emergency pavilion, a dedicated space for acute care, the direct conceptual ancestor of the modern emergency room. In 1883, Bellevue initiated a residency training program for surgeons that established a model, structured, supervised, progressively responsible clinical training that remains the foundation of surgical education worldwide. A year later, the Carnegie Laboratory opened at Bellevue, the first pathology and bacteriology laboratory in the United States, built at the precise moment that germ theory was finally making its way into American medical practice. The laboratory gave physicians tools to identify what was actually killing their patients, replacing centuries of educated guesswork with something approaching evidence. The individuals who came through Bellevue during these decades were equally remarkable. Dr. Russell Myers trained at Bellevue under the neurologist Foster Kennedy and became the pioneer of functional ultrasonic neurosurgery, using sound waves rather than instruments to treat disorders of the brain, a concept so far ahead of its time that it took decades for the rest of the field to catch up. According to historical accounts, Dr. Dorothy Clenka Nash, who trained and worked at Bellevue, was the only active female neurosurgeon in the United States for much of the period between 1928 and 1960, a distinction that speaks as much to the barriers of her era as to her individual determination, and one that the historical record has not given nearly enough attention. In 1960, Nina Starr Braunwald performed the first successful mitral valve replacement in history at Bellevue. The repair of a human heart valve, a procedure now performed routinely in hospitals around the world, happened for the first time inside the same institution that had begun as a 6-bed almshouse on the city commons. The central irony of all of this does not resolve neatly, and it shouldn't. The foundations of modern American medicine were laid inside a hospital that society built, originally, to make its poor invisible. The patients who made all of this innovation possible were the same people the city had always sent to Bellevue, those who had no other options, no private physicians, no ability to refuse. Their suffering was the raw material from which American medicine constructed itself. That debt has never been fully acknowledged. It probably never will be. Chapter 6: The Ward That Said Yes. In the early 1980s, a disease began moving through New York City that no one had a name for yet. It appeared first in clusters, young men, mostly, presenting with infections that healthy immune systems should have fought off without difficulty. Pneumonia that wouldn't resolve. Rare cancers appearing in people far too young to develop them. A pattern that suggested the body's own defenses had been somehow switched off. Doctors who saw these cases early described a feeling of profound disorientation. The sensation of encountering something entirely outside the boundaries of their training, something the medical literature offered no guidance on whatsoever. By the time the condition had a name, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, AIDS, the fear surrounding it had already outpaced the science. Transmission was poorly understood, treatment was non-existent, and the populations most visibly affected carried stigmas that the broader culture was not prepared to set aside in the name of medical compassion. Gay men, intravenous drug users, Haitian immigrants. These were, in the eyes of much of mainstream America, people whose suffering could be categorized as consequence rather than tragedy. The moral failure this represented was not subtle, and it was not confined to the general public. Hospitals turned patients away. Medical professionals, afraid of a disease they didn't understand and unwilling to treat populations they didn't respect, declined to provide care. Nurses requested transfers rather than work on wards where AIDS patients were admitted. Physicians documented their cases from a distance that was as much emotional as clinical. The American healthcare system, in the early years of the AIDS epidemic, demonstrated with painful clarity that its obligations had limits, and that those limits fell along lines of class and sexuality and race that had always been present but could now no longer be concealed. The obligation at Bellevue was absolute. As a public safety net hospital, Bellevue operated under a simple and non-negotiable duty. It could not turn people away. The patients that other hospitals refused arrived at Bellevue's doors, and Bellevue took them in. Not because the institution was without fear, not because its staff were immune to the confusion and grief that the epidemic produced everywhere, but because the alternative, turning away the sick, was not available to it. This constraint, born of Bellevue's most basic institutional identity, placed it at the center of the epidemic's medical response almost by default. Ward 17. West became Bellevue's dedicated AIDS treatment unit. one of the first such dedicated wards at any hospital in the country. The nurses and doctors who worked there were building their protocols from nothing, in real time, in an atmosphere thick with uncertainty and loss. There were no established treatment regimens to follow. There were no senior physicians who had managed this disease through its stages and could offer guidance based on experience. Every decision was made at the frontier of knowledge, which meant that every decision carried the weight of genuine unknowing. Staff worked through that uncertainty anyway, documenting everything, sharing information across institutions, constructing a body of clinical knowledge about AIDS management piece by piece from the cases moving through their wards. One floor away, in a different register entirely, was Ward 12 East. 12 East was Bellevue's palliative care ward for AIDS patients in the final stages of the disease. In the early and middle years of the epidemic, before any effective treatment existed, this was where many of the hospital's AIDS patients ended their lives. The ward operated with a quietness that the rest of the hospital did not have. Not the quietness of peace, but the quietness of a place where the work had shifted from treatment to accompaniment. Nurses and social workers and chaplains sat with patients who had, in many cases, been abandoned by their families, cut off by their communities, left with no one but the staff of a public hospital to witness the end of their lives. The moral weight of that work, done day after day, year after year, without recognition or adequate resources, inside an epidemic that much of the country preferred not to look at directly, is difficult to overstate. The patients who moved through 17 West and 12 East were, in the deepest sense, the same people Bellevue had always received, the city's most stigmatized, the ones that other institutions had declined to help. This was not new. The names of the diseases changed across the centuries. The dynamic did not. In 1996, Bellevue's physicians played a meaningful role in the development of what became known as the triple drug cocktail. Highly active antiretroviral therapy, or HART. The combination of 3 antiretroviral drugs administered simultaneously proved capable of suppressing the virus to undetectable levels in many patients, transforming AIDS from a death sentence into a chronic manageable condition. It was one of the most significant medical breakthroughs of the 20th century, and part of the clinical foundation that made it possible was built inside the wards of a public hospital that had been treating the epidemic's most abandoned patients for 15 years. The toll on Bellevue's staff across those 15 years was real and lasting. Doctors and nurses who had watched ward after ward of patients die from a disease they could not stop described a form of grief that accumulated differently from ordinary loss. Not sharp and singular, but slow and cumulative. A weight that built across years until it became part of the institutional atmosphere itself. Bellevue carried that weight, as it had always carried. Everything the city sent its way. What the AIDS crisis confirmed about Bellevue was not something new. It was something very old. This was not a hospital that had ever operated from a position of prestige or choice. It had operated, from its very first years, from a position of obligation. The obligation that falls on the institution that serves the people. Other institutions have already turned away. That stands at the exact point where society's failures and medicine's possibilities meet. 17 West was not an exception to Bellevue's history. It was the clearest expression of it. Chapter 7. When the lights went out. By the final decades of the 20th century, Bellevue was carrying the weight of its own history in ways that were becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. The physical infrastructure of the hospital was aging. The funding that a public institution of its scale required had never been consistently provided. City budgets contracted and expanded with the political winds, and Bellevue, serving a population with no political leverage and no private insurance to generate revenue, was perennially at the back of the line when resources were distributed. The New York City fiscal crisis of the 1970s had cut deep into the public hospital system, and while Bellevue survived that period, it survived it carrying wounds that never fully healed. Deferred maintenance accumulated, staffing remained chronically strained. The gap between what the hospital was asked to do and what it was given the means to do grew wider with each passing decade. This was not a dramatic collapse. It was something more insidious. The slow, grinding pressure of institutional neglect applied to a place that could not close and could not refuse, that had to remain open regardless of the conditions under which it operated. Bellevue in the late 20th century was a hospital running on obligation and momentum, held together by the commitment of its staff and the absence of any alternative for the communities it served. Then, on the 29th of October, 2012, the Atlantic Ocean arrived. Hurricane Sandy made landfall on the northeastern United States with a force that overwhelmed the infrastructure of one of the most developed urban environments on Earth. In Manhattan, the storm surge pushed water inland with a speed and volume that the city's systems were not built to handle. At Bellevue, the floodwaters reached the basement, and in the basement sat the generators that powered the entire hospital. When the generators failed, Bellevue went dark. What followed was one of the most complex logistical operations in the hospital's nearly 300-year history. Hundreds of patients had to be evacuated from a 25-story building with no power in the middle of a storm to receiving hospitals that were themselves operating under emergency conditions. Staff carried patients down flights of stairs in the dark. Medical teams worked by flashlight and the glow of battery-powered equipment to keep people alive through a transfer process that no disaster plan had fully anticipated. Every patient was evacuated. No one was left behind. The Sandy evacuation raised a question that the city could not easily answer. What happens when the hospital of last resort becomes the emergency itself? Bellevue existed precisely to receive the overflow. The patients other hospitals couldn't take the crises other institutions weren't equipped to handle. When Bellevue went offline, even temporarily, it exposed a structural vulnerability at the heart of New York City's public health system. The safety net had its own breaking point. The hospital reopened after the storm. Repairs were made. The generators were reportedly relocated to higher ground. But the image of Bellevue in darkness remained as a reminder that the institution's endurance had never been guaranteed. And a harder question lingered in the aftermath. How long can a last line hold if the city behind it never fully commits to what that line is defending? 2 years later, in October of 2014, a different kind of test arrived. Craig Spencer, a physician who had spent the previous month working with Doctors Without Borders in Guinea during the West African Ebola outbreak, returned to New York City and fell ill. He was admitted to Bellevue. The diagnosis was confirmed: Ebola. The media response was immediate and intense. Cable news ran the story around the clock. Public fear, amplified by coverage that often generated more heat than light, produced a level of anxiety in the city that bore little relationship to the actual epidemiological risk. Bellevue found itself at the center of a national conversation about contagion and preparedness and the boundaries of medical obligation, conducted largely by people who had never set foot in the building and had no particular knowledge of how it operated. Inside the hospital, the response was methodical. Bellevue had been designated years earlier as one of New York City's facilities for handling precisely this kind of high-consequence infectious disease. Its staff had trained for it, the protocols were followed. Craig Spencer recovered and was discharged. The feared spread to other patients or staff did not occur. Meanwhile, on the edges of the main campus, the old psychiatric building stood as a monument to institutional ambiguity. Converted to a men's homeless shelter in 1998, it had spent subsequent years as the subject of redevelopment proposals that never materialized, including plans, abandoned in 2010, to convert it into a hotel and conference center. The deal fell through. The building remained. Its residents were, as they had always been, the people the city needed to house somewhere and preferred not to think about too carefully. Nearly 3 centuries after a 2-story brick almshouse was built on the city commons to hold 6 beds and the people no one else wanted, Bellevue was still standing, still open, still receiving. Not because the city had finally given it what it needed, but because the city's need for it had never stopped. Chapter 8: What We Built to Forget. Step back far enough from Bellevue's history, and a single image comes into focus. Not the famous patients, not the poets and novelists and accused killers who passed through its wards and lent their names to its legend. Not the pioneering surgeons or the researchers or the doctors who performed procedures no one had ever attempted before. Those people matter, and their stories are real, but they are not the heart of what Bellevue is. The heart of what Bellevue is can be found in the people whose names were never recorded. The Irish immigrant carried off a ship in 1849, feverish and alone in a city that didn't speak his language. the garment worker who collapsed in a Lower East Side tenement during the influenza winter of 1918. The young man admitted to 17 West in 1983, already dying from a disease that much of the country had decided he deserved. The person sleeping tonight in the building that used to be the Pavilion for the insane, in a bed a few hundred feet from where cholera patients were once warehoused and forgotten. These are the people Bellevue was built for. Not intentionally, not generously, but inevitably. Because when a city grows faster than its conscience, when its prosperity and its poverty expand in parallel, and its institutions are designed to serve one and contain the other, someone has to stand at the point where that contradiction becomes most acute. Bellevue has stood at that point for nearly 300 years. It has never been given enough. It has never been allowed to close. It has been tested by cholera and influenza and AIDS and floodwater and fear. And each time it has steadied itself and remained open. Because the alternative, the city admitting that some of its people simply do not matter enough to save, has never been acceptable to say out loud, even when it has been perfectly acceptable to enact in practice. Tonight, the lights in the tower on First Avenue are still on. The old iron gate still stands. The East River moves past in the dark, indifferent as it has always been. And inside, someone is being seen by a doctor who showed up anyway. That is not a story of triumph. It is not quite a story of failure either. It is the story of what it costs, in human effort, in institutional endurance, in the quiet determination of people who kept coming back to care for those a society would rather forget. Bellevue has been paying that cost on behalf of New York City and on behalf of America for longer than the nation itself has existed. It is still paying it now.